Sarah Martinez sat in the back corner of the music room, just like she did every day after school. She liked this spot because no one could see her there. The old piano blocked her from view, and the music stands created a small wall around her. This was her safe place. She opened her violin case carefully. The instrument was old but beautiful. It had belonged to her grandmother, who died when Sarah was 12. Her mother had given it to her on her 13th birthday. Sarah remembered that day clearly. She had cried when she saw the violin because it reminded her of Grandma Rosa. Sarah picked up her bow and started to play. The music flowed from her fingers like water. She did not think about the notes. She just felt them. The violin sang under her touch, making sounds that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her heart. Mrs. Chun, the music teacher, stood outside the door listening. She did this every day now. For 3 months she had been watching Sarah play alone in the corner. The girl had no idea how special her gift was. Mrs. Chun had been teaching music for 25 years, and she had never heard a student play with such natural feeling. Sarah played a sad song that made Mrs. Chun think of rain on windows. Then she switched to something happy that sounded like children laughing in a playground. The music changed. Like the weather, and Sarah's face showed every emotion the violin expressed. When Sarah finished playing, she looked up and saw Mrs. Chun standing in the doorway. Her cheeks turned red with embarrassment. She quickly put her violin down and started to pack it away. "Don't stop," Mrs. Chun said softly. "That was beautiful." Sarah's hands shook as she continued putting her violin in its case. "I was just practicing," she said quietly. "I didn't know anyone was listening." Mrs. Chun walked into the room and sat on a chair near Sarah's corner. "How long have you been playing?" 4 years, Sarah answered, not looking up from her violin case. "Who taught you to play like that?" Sarah finally looked at Mrs. Chun. "Like what? With such feeling, such heart." Sarah shrugged. "No one taught me that. I just play what I feel inside." Mrs. Chun nodded slowly. She had suspected this. Sarah was what teachers call a natural. Some people learn music from books and lessons. Others, like Sarah, seem to be born with music already living inside them. "Sarah, I want to ask you something," Mrs. Chun said. "The annual talent show is coming up in 6 weeks. I think you should perform." Sarah's eyes grew wide with fear. "No," she said quickly. "I can't do that. Why not?" "I don't like people watching me. I get scared. My hands shake. I can't breathe right." Sarah's voice got smaller with each word. Mrs. Chun understood. She had seen this before with gifted students. Sometimes the most talented people were also the most afraid to share their gifts. "What if I told you that your music could make people happy?" Mrs. Chun asked. "What if I said that your playing could help someone who was having a bad day feel better?" Sarah thought about this. She remembered how her grandmother's playing had always made her feel better when she was sad or scared. Grandma Rosa would play her violin, and suddenly everything seemed okay again. "But what if I make mistakes?" Sarah asked. "Everyone makes mistakes," Mrs. Chun said. "But you have something special, Sarah. You have the ability to touch people's hearts with your music." "That's a rare gift." Sarah was quiet for a long time. She thought about her grandmother, who had always been brave. Grandma Rosa had played violin in the town square every Sunday after church. She had never seemed afraid. "I don't know, Sarah," said finally. Mrs. Chun stood up. "Think about it, okay? You don't have to decide right now. But remember, your grandmother would be proud to see you sharing her violin with the world." After Mrs. Chun left, Sarah sat alone with her thoughts. She opened her violin case again and touched the smooth wood. She could almost hear her grandmother's voice saying, "Music is meant to be shared, Mia. It's not meant to hide in corners." That night at dinner, Sarah's mother, Maria, noticed that her daughter was quieter than usual. Sarah picked at her food and stared out the window. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Maria asked. Sarah told her mother about Mrs. Chun's request. She explained how scared she felt about playing in front of people. Maria reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "Do you remember what Grandma Rosa used to say about fear?" Sarah nodded. "She said fear was just excitement wearing a disguise." That's right. She also said that the most beautiful flowers grow in the places that get the most sunlight. Maybe it's time for you to step into the sunlight. Sarah's younger brother, Diego, who was 14, looked up from his phone. You should do it, Sarah. You're really good. I hear you playing sometimes, and it doesn't sound like other people's violin music. It sounds real. This surprised Sarah. Diego never paid attention to her music. He was always busy with his friends or his video games. You really think so? She asked him. Yeah, besides, if you mess up, no one will remember after a week anyway. Maria laughed. Diego, you're supposed to be encouraging your sister. I am encouraging her, Diego said. I'm telling her it's not a big deal if she messes up. That weekend, Sarah visited her grandmother's grave. She brought her violin and played quietly among the headstones. The cemetery was peaceful, with old oak trees and birds singing in the branches. I don't know what to do, Grandma, Sarah whispered to the stone marker. Mrs. Chun wants me to play for lots of people, but I'm scared. A gentle breeze moved through the trees, making the leaves whisper. Sarah closed her eyes and remembered her grandmother's. Hands guiding hers on the violin strings when she first started learning, Grandma Rosa had been fearless. She had come to America from Mexico with nothing but her violin and her dreams. She had played music to make money when times were hard. She had never been afraid to let people hear. Her heart through her music. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at her grandmother's name carved in the stone. Rosa Martinez, beloved mother, grandmother, and musician. Maybe I could try, Sarah said softly, just this once. On Monday morning, Sarah found Mrs. Chun in the music room before school started. I've been thinking about the talent show, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Chun looked up hopefully. And I think maybe but only if I can play something simple, something easy. I don't want to play anything complicated. Mrs. Chun smiled. Of course, we can choose something simple. What would make you feel comfortable? Sarah thought for a moment. Maybe something everyone knows. Something that won't surprise people. That sounds perfect, Mrs. Chun said. We have 6 weeks to prepare. That's plenty of time. As Sarah walked to her first class, she felt a mix of excitement and terror in her stomach. She had just agreed to do the thing that scared her most. But somewhere deep inside, she also felt something else. She felt proud. Grandma Rosa would have been proud too. She didn't know it yet, but this decision would change her life forever. Sometimes the most important moments start with the smallest steps. Sarah had just taken her first step toward something amazing. The next day, Mrs. Chun had an idea ready for Sarah. She was waiting in the music room with a big smile on her face. I know exactly what you should play, Mrs. Chun said as soon as Sarah walked in. Sarah sat down in her usual corner spot and opened her violin case. What is it? Twinkle, twinkle, little star? Sarah looked up, surprised. That's a baby song. I learned that when I was 8 years old. Exactly, Mrs. Chun said. Everyone knows it. It's simple, it's safe, and you can make it beautiful. Sarah thought about this. She had to admit that playing a song everyone knew would be less scary than playing something new or complicated. If she forgot the notes, she could probably figure them out because the melody was so familiar. Okay, Sarah said slowly. I can do that. Double quotes. Mrs. Chun sat down next to her. The wonderful thing about simple songs is that they give you room to be creative. When people know what to expect, you can surprise them in small ways. Sarah started playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star the way she had learned it years ago. The notes were clean and precise, but they sounded exactly like every other beginner's version of the song. That's perfect, Mrs. Chun said. Now try it again, but this time, don't think about the notes. Think about what the song means. What does it mean? Sarah asked. What do you think it means? Sarah closed her eyes and thought about the words. A little star twinkling in the sky, someone wondering what it was. She imagined a child looking up at the night sky, full of curiosity and wonder. When she played it the second time, something was different. The notes were the same, but they seemed to sparkle. Sarah's bow moved more gently across the strings, and she added tiny pauses that made the melody breathe. Beautiful, Mrs. Chun said softly. That's exactly what I mean. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah practiced Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star every day. At first, she played it the same way each time, but gradually she began to notice that the song sounded different depending on how she felt. When she was happy, the melody bounced like a ball. When she was thinking about her grandmother, it became gentle and warm. When she was worried about the talent show, it trembled slightly, like a voice that was about to cry. Sarah's brother Diego noticed the changes too. One evening, he was doing homework at the kitchen table while Sarah practiced in the living room. "Why? Does that song sound different every time you play it?" he asked during dinner. "What do you mean?" Sarah said, "I mean, it's the same song, but sometimes it sounds happy and sometimes it sounds sad. How do you do that?" Sarah had never thought about it before. "I don't know. I just play how I feel." Her mother, Maria, smiled. "That's what Grandma Rosa used to do. She said music was a language of feelings." Sarah remembered this. Her grandmother had always said that the notes on the page were just the beginning. The real music came from the heart. At school, word was getting around about the talent show. Students were talking about what they were going to perform. There would be singers, dancers, a comedy act, and even a magic show. Sarah's friend Emma found her in the library one day. "I heard you're going to be in the talent show," Emma said. "What are you going to do?" "Play violin," Sarah said quietly. "That's so cool. What song?" Sarah felt embarrassed. "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." Emma looked confused. "Isn't that kind of easy?" Sarah's cheeks turned red. "Mrs. Chun thought it would be good for me." "Oh," Emma said, "I'm sure you'll make it sound good." But Sarah could tell that Emma was disappointed. Everyone else was doing exciting, modern things. Sarah was going to play a children's song. That afternoon, Sarah found Mrs. Chun and told her about the conversation with Emma. "Maybe I should play something else," Sarah said. "Something more impressive." Mrs. Chun shook her head. "Sarah, do you know who wrote Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?" "No. The melody is by Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, one of the greatest composers who ever lived. He wrote variations on this tune that are still performed in concert halls today." Sarah's eyes widened. She had never known that. "Mozart understood that simple melodies are often the most powerful," Mrs. Chun continued. "They speak to everyone, from children to adults. They don't need fancy decorations to be beautiful." This made Sarah feel better. If Mozart thought the song was worth writing about, maybe it wasn't too simple after all. Sarah kept practicing every day. She practiced in the music room after school, at home in the evenings, and sometimes even during lunch break. The song became as familiar to her as breathing, but something strange was happening. The more she played the simple melody, the more she heard possibilities in it. She began to notice places where she could make the notes longer or shorter. She found spots where she could play softer or louder. She discovered that she could make the violin sound like it was asking a question, or like it was telling a secret. Mrs. Chun watched these changes with excitement. She had seen this before with truly gifted students. They started with something simple and gradually made it their own. Sarah was not just learning to play the song. She was learning to speak through her violin. "You're starting to find your voice," Mrs. Chun told her one day. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Every musician has a unique voice, just like every person has a unique speaking voice. You're discovering what yours sounds like." Sarah practiced extra hard that week. She wanted to make sure she knew the song perfectly. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes in front of all those people, but Diego noticed that she was getting nervous. At dinner one night, he saw her hands shaking slightly as she reached for her water glass. "You're worried about the talent show," he said. "A little," Sarah admitted. "You know what Mom always says about butterflies in your stomach?" Sarah smiled. "She says they just mean you care about something." "Right, and you know what Grandma Rosa used to say about performing?" Sarah thought for a moment. "She said the audience wants you to succeed. They're not hoping you'll fail." "Exactly. People come to hear music because it makes them feel good. They want you to do well. Maria reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Your grandmother also used to say that when you're nervous, you should remember why you're playing. Are you playing to impress people, or are you playing to share something beautiful with them? Sarah thought about this question for a long time. That night, she realized that she had been thinking about the talent show as a test she had to pass. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a chance to give people a gift. The next morning, Sarah found a note in her locker. It was from Mrs. Chun. Remember, the note said, you're not performing for the audience. You're performing with them. Music is something we share. Sarah folded the note carefully and put it in her pocket. She carried it with her for the rest of the week. As the talent show got closer, Sarah noticed that her practice sessions were changing. She was no longer worried about playing the notes correctly. She knew them perfectly. Instead, she was thinking about the story she wanted to tell. She imagined herself as a child, looking up at the stars and wondering about the mysteries of the universe. She thought about all the children who had sung this song throughout history. She thought about Mozart writing his variations hundreds of years ago. She thought about her grandmother, who had probably played this melody for Sarah's mother when she was little. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star was not just a simple song. It was a connection to everyone who had ever looked at the night sky and felt wonder. 2 days before the talent show, Mrs. Chun asked Sarah to play the song one more time. Sarah closed her eyes and began to play. The familiar melody flowed from her violin, but now it was more than just notes. It was a conversation between Sarah and everyone who would listen. It was a bridge between her heart and theirs. When she finished, Mrs. Chun was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, she said finally, I think you're ready for something wonderful. Sarah woke up on the morning of the talent show with her stomach doing somersaults. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined herself on stage in front of hundreds of people. She looked at the clock. It was only 6 in the morning, but she knew she would not be able to go back to sleep. She got up quietly and went to the kitchen. Her mother was already there, making coffee. Couldn't sleep either? Maria asked with a gentle smile. Sarah shook her head. I keep thinking about tonight. Maria poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down next to Sarah. Do you want to talk about what's scaring you? What if I forget how to play? What if my hands shake so much that I can't hold the bow? What if people laugh? Maria took Sarah's hands in hers. Do you remember when you were little and you were afraid of swimming in the deep end of the pool? Sarah nodded. I told you that fear was like standing at the edge of something new. You could either step back and stay safe, or you could jump in and discover that you were stronger than you thought. But this feels different, Sarah said. This feels bigger. It is bigger, Maria agreed, but so are you. You're not the same. Little girl who was afraid of the deep end, you've grown. You've learned. And tonight you get to show people how much you've grown. Sarah spent the morning trying to distract herself. She watched television, helped her mother with laundry, and even played video games with Diego, but no matter what she did, her mind kept returning to the evening ahead. At lunch, Diego noticed that Sarah was only picking at her sandwich. You have to eat, he said. You need energy for tonight. I'm not hungry, Sarah replied. Okay, but don't blame me if you faint on stage. Diego, Maria scolded. What? I'm just being practical. Despite his teasing, Diego was actually worried about his sister. He had never seen her this nervous before. That afternoon, while Sarah was taking a shower, he called Mrs. Chun. Hi, Mrs. Chun. This is Diego, Sarah's brother. I think she's really scared about tonight. Mrs. Chun appreciated Diego's concern. That's normal, she said. Even professional musicians get nervous before big performances. The important thing is that Sarah remembers why she's doing this. Can you talk to her? I'll see her at school this afternoon for the dress rehearsal. I'll make sure she's okay. When Sarah arrived at school that afternoon, the auditorium was buzzing with activity. Students were setting up microphones, testing lights, and practicing their acts one last time. Sarah watched from the side of the stage as other performers ran through their routines. There was Jennifer, who was going to sing a pop song while dancing. There were the comedy twins, Marcus and Michael, who were telling jokes and making everyone laugh. There was the dance group with their matching costumes and perfect choreography. Everyone. LOOKED, so confident, so prepared, so professional. Sarah looked down at her simple black dress and her grandmother's old violin case. She felt very small and ordinary. Mrs. Chun found her sitting on a chair backstage, looking pale. "How are you feeling?" Mrs. Chun asked. "Like I don't belong here," Sarah said honestly. Mrs. Chun sat down next to her. "Can I tell you a secret?" "What?" "Every single person you see here is nervous. Jennifer threw up in the bathroom 20 minutes ago. Marcus and Michael have been practicing their jokes over and over because they're afraid they'll forget them. The dance group has been arguing about their formation because they're worried about making mistakes." Sarah looked surprised. "Really? Really? Being nervous means you care. It means this matters to you." Mrs. Chun stood up. "Come on. Let's go to the music room so you can practice one more time." In the quiet music room, away from all the noise and activity, Sarah felt calmer. She opened her violin case and touched the smooth wood of her grandmother's instrument. "Before you play," Mrs. Chun said, "I want you to remember something. You're not performing tonight to prove anything to anyone. You're sharing a gift." "Your grandmother's gift, passed down to you?" Sarah nodded and lifted her violin to her shoulder. She began to play "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" and immediately felt better. The familiar melody was like an old friend. She knew every note, every phrase, every pause, but as she played she realized something had changed. The song no longer sounded simple to her. It sounded rich and full of possibilities. She heard layers in the melody that she had never noticed before. She felt connections to memories and emotions that went deeper than just the notes. When she finished, Mrs. Chun was smiling. "That," she said, "is going to be beautiful." By 6 o'clock, families were starting to arrive at the school. Sarah watched through the window as cars pulled into the parking lot. She saw parents carrying flowers for their children. She saw grandparents walking slowly toward the auditorium entrance. She saw younger siblings running ahead of their families, excited for the show. Her own family arrived at 6:30. Maria had brought a small bouquet of roses for Sarah. Diego was wearing a nice shirt instead of his usual t-shirt. Even Sarah's aunt and uncle had come, along with her 2 little cousins. "Mia," her aunt said, hugging Sarah tight. "We're so proud of you for being brave," her uncle nodded. "Your grandmother would be so happy to see you tonight." Sarah's little cousins, ages 5 and 7, looked up at her with wide eyes. "Are you going to be on the big stage?" asked Rosa, the younger one, who was named after Sarah's grandmother. "Yes," Sarah said. "Are you scared?" asked Miguel, the older one. Sarah thought about lying, but decided to be honest. "A little bit." "That's okay," Rosa said seriously. "When I was in the Christmas play at school, I was scared too. But then I remembered that everyone watching me loves me, so it was okay." Sarah smiled. Sometimes the wisest words came from the youngest people. At 7 o'clock, the performers were called backstage for final instructions. The principal, Mr. Rodriguez, gathered everyone together. "I want you all to remember," he said, "that tonight is about celebrating your talents and sharing them with our community. Don't worry about being perfect. Just be yourselves and have fun." Sarah looked around at the other performers. They all looked nervous but excited. She realized that Mrs. Chun was right. They were all in this together. The show began at 7:30. Sarah was scheduled to perform 9th out of 12 acts, which meant she had to wait for about an hour before her turn. She sat in a chair at the side of the stage, listening to the sounds from the auditorium. The first act was a group of 3rd graders, singing a song about friendship. They were adorable, and the audience clapped enthusiastically. Next came a high school senior playing guitar and singing a song he had written himself. Then came the dance group, followed by Jennifer with her pop song performance. Each act brought different reactions from the audience. Sarah could hear laughter during the comedy acts, applause after the musical performances, and even some cheering during the more energetic dance numbers. As her turn got closer, Sarah's heart began to beat faster. She could feel her palms getting sweaty. She wiped them on her dress and tried to take deep breaths like Mrs. Chun had taught her. The eighth act was finishing up. A group of middle school students had just performed a scene from a play. Sarah heard the applause and knew it was almost time. Mrs. Chun appeared at her side. Ready? Sarah's mouth felt dry. I think so. Remember, Mrs. Chun said quietly, you're not alone up there. Your grandmother will be with you. Your family will be with you, and I'll be right here in the wings cheering you on. Mr. Rodriguez walked to the microphone at center stage. Our next performer is Sarah Martinez, a junior here at Lincoln High School. She will be playing violin for us this evening. Sarah stood up on shaky legs. Mrs. Chun gave her a quick hug. Go make some magic, she whispered. Sarah walked onto the stage carrying her violin and bow. The lights were brighter than she had expected. The auditorium looked huge, filled with hundreds of faces she could barely see beyond the glare of the stage lights. She walked to the center of the stage and looked out at the audience. For a moment she felt frozen. Her mind went blank. She could not remember how Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star was supposed to start. Then, in the sea of faces, she spotted her family. Her mother was in the third row, smiling and nodding encouragingly. Diego was giving her a thumbs up. Her aunt and uncle were beaming with pride. And little Rosa was waving at her. Sarah took a deep breath and raised her violin to her shoulder. She closed her eyes for just a moment and thought about her grandmother. She could almost feel Grandma Rosa's presence beside her, guiding her hands just like she had done when Sarah was learning to play. She opened her eyes, looked out at the audience one more time, and began to play. The first notes of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star rang out clear and sweet in the quiet auditorium. Sarah felt her nervousness begin to fade as the familiar melody flowed from her violin. She was no longer standing on a scary stage in front of strangers. She was simply sharing a song that she loved with people who had come to listen. Sarah began with the melody exactly as she had practiced it. The notes were clean and clear, just like any music student might play them. She felt safe in the familiar pattern. Each note came exactly where it was supposed to come. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you are. But something was happening that Sarah had not planned. As she played, she began to feel the music differently than she had during practice. The stage lights created a warm glow around her, and the quiet attention of the audience made her feel like she was inside a special bubble, where only the music mattered. Without thinking about it, Sarah started to let the melody breathe more. She made some notes a little longer, gave tiny pauses between phrases, and let her bow move more gently across the strings. The simple song began to sound less like a practice exercise and more like a conversation. In the audience, people were settling into their seats and preparing to listen politely to a student's basic violin performance. Parents were getting comfortable, expecting to hear a nice but unremarkable version of a children's song, but Sarah's grandmother's violin had other ideas. As Sarah moved into the second line of the melody, something magical began to happen. The notes started to shimmer. Sarah found herself adding tiny ornaments to the melody, little grace notes and gentle slides between pitches that she had never practiced but that felt completely natural, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky. Mrs. Chun stood in the wings, watching in amazement. This was not the same performance Sarah had given during their practice sessions. This was something entirely new. The girl was discovering things about the music that she had never found before. Sarah was completely absorbed in what she was doing. She had forgotten about the audience, forgotten about her nervousness, forgotten about everything except the conversation she was having with her violin. The instrument seemed to be telling her secrets, showing her hidden paths through the familiar melody. When she reached the end of the first complete verse, instead of stopping or simply repeating it, Sarah found herself beginning a variation. She had never planned this. She had never practiced it. But her fingers seemed to know exactly what to do. The basic melody was still there. But now it was decorated with runs of 16th notes that sparkled like stars. Sarah's bow danced across the strings, creating sounds that were both delicate and powerful. The simple children's song was transforming into something sophisticated and beautiful. In the audience, people began to sit up straighter. This was not what they had expected. Parents who had been half listening while checking their phones looked up. Teachers who had heard hundreds of student performances over the years found themselves leaning forward. Sarah played with her eyes closed now, completely lost in the music. She was no longer thinking about technique or fingering or bow placement. She was simply feeling the music flow through her and allowing her grandmother's violin to sing its heart out. The melody soared up into the higher registers, where it sounded like actual twinkling stars. Then it dropped down into the lower strings, where it became warm and rich like velvet. Sarah's left hand found positions she had never used before, stretching to reach notes that added depth and color to the simple tune. A woman in the fifth row whispered to her husband, "Is that really just Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star?" He nodded, unable to speak. He was a music professor at the local college, and he recognized what he was hearing. This teenager was doing something that professional musicians spent years learning how to do. She was taking a basic melody and making it completely her own. Sarah began the third variation, and this time the music became even more adventurous. She played with the rhythm, sometimes making it swing like jazz, sometimes making it flow like a classical adagio. The melody twisted and turned through musical ideas that seemed to come from some deep place in her musical soul. Her bow work was becoming more expressive too. Sometimes she used long, smooth strokes that made the notes sing endlessly. Other times she used short, light touches that made the violin sound like it was laughing. The instrument responded to every tiny movement of her wrist and fingers. Diego sat in the audience with his mouth open. He had heard his sister practice this song dozens of times at home. It had never sounded anything like this. This was like watching someone he knew turn into a completely different person. Sarah's mother, Maria, had tears starting to form in her eyes. She could see her own mother, Rosa, in Sarah's playing. The way Sarah held her head, the way she swayed slightly with the music, the way she seemed to disappear into the sound, it was exactly like watching Rosa play all those years ago. The music was telling a story now. Sarah played phrases that sounded like questions. "What are you, little star?" Then she played answers that seemed to come from the star itself. "I am wonder. I am mystery. I am the dreams of children looking up at the night sky." In the back of the auditorium, a man with a notebook was writing frantically. He was a music critic from the local newspaper who had come to write a simple review of a school talent show. He had expected to write a few polite paragraphs about children doing their best. Instead, he was witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah moved into what would be her final variation, and this time the music became deeply emotional. She played with such feeling that every note seemed to carry the weight of human experience. The simple melody became a meditation on wonder, on childhood, on the mystery of existence itself. The violin sang under her touch. Long, sustained notes floated over the audience like blessings. Quick passages sparkled like laughter. Deep, rich chords resonated like prayers. Sarah was not just playing music. She was channeling something universal and profound. An elderly man in the front row found himself thinking about his own childhood, looking up at stars from his family's farm 70 years ago. A young mother holding her baby felt the music speak to her hopes for her child's future. A teenager struggling with his own identity heard something in the music that told him he was not alone. Mrs. Chun stood in the wings with her hand over her heart. In 25 years of teaching, she had never seen anything like this. Sarah had transcended technique, transcended performance, transcended even music itself. She was creating art in its purest form. Sarah played the familiar melody one last time, but now it was completely transformed. Every note was infused with everything she had discovered during her musical journey. The simple tune had become a universe of sound and emotion. As she drew near the end, Sarah opened her eyes for the first time since the beginning of her performance. She saw the audience watching her with complete attention. No one was moving. No one was whispering. No one was checking their phones. Hundreds of people were sitting in perfect silence, hanging on every note, but Sarah was no longer nervous about being watched. She felt connected to every person in the room. The music had built a bridge between her heart and theirs. They were all sharing this moment together. She played the final phrase with infinite tenderness, letting each note fade gently into the next. The last note hung in the air like a star itself, twinkling softly before gradually fading into silence. Sarah lowered her violin and opened her eyes fully. She looked out at the audience and saw something she had never expected. She saw faces filled with wonder, with joy, with tears, with amazement. She had given them something beautiful, and they had received it with open hearts. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched on and on. Sarah began to wonder if something was wrong. Had she played too long? Had she strayed too far from the simple song she was supposed to perform? Then she realized that the silence was not empty. It was full. It was the kind of silence that comes after something sacred has happened. It was the silence of people trying to hold on to a perfect moment before it slipped away. Sarah stood on the stage, still holding her violin and bow, and understood that something had changed forever. She was no longer the scared girl who had walked onto this stage 10 minutes ago. She had discovered something about herself, about music, and about the power of sharing beauty with others. The transformation was complete. Not just of the simple song, but of Sarah herself. The silence that followed Sarah's last note was unlike anything anyone in the auditorium had ever experienced. It was not the usual pause before applause. It was something deeper, more profound. It was as if the entire room had been placed under a spell. In the third row, Sarah's mother Maria sat perfectly still. Her hands were clasped in her lap, and tears were streaming down her cheeks. She had not expected to hear her own mother's spirit come alive through Sarah's playing. The music had transported her back to her childhood, to Sunday afternoons when Rosa would play violin on the front porch, while Maria and her siblings played in the yard. Next to Maria, Diego stared at his sister with his mouth slightly open. He had never really understood what people meant when they talked about music being powerful. Music was just noise to him, sometimes pleasant noise, but still just noise. Tonight, for the first time in his life, he understood. His sister had not just played sounds. She had created something that reached inside him and touched places he did not know existed. In the front row, the elderly man named Frank was remembering things he had not thought about in decades. The music had awakened memories of his grandmother singing lullabies, of Christmas mornings when he was 7 years old, of the first time he had kissed his wife under a starry sky 60 years ago. He sat with his weathered hands folded, afraid to move and break the magic. 2 rows behind him, a young teacher named Lisa was thinking about why she had become an educator. She had been feeling burned out lately, wondering if she was making any difference in her students' lives. But hearing Sarah play reminded her that teaching was about helping young people discover the extraordinary things that lived inside them. She made a mental note to be more patient with her students tomorrow. Near the back of the auditorium, a teenager named Marcus was dealing with his own struggles. His parents were getting divorced, his grades were falling, and he felt like his world was falling apart. But something in Sarah's music told him that beauty still existed in the world, that there were still reasons to hope. He sat very still, letting the feeling wash over him. The baby in the young mother's arms had stopped fussing completely. She was looking up at the stage with wide, curious eyes, as if she could sense that something special was happening. Her mother, Jennifer, rocked her gently and thought about all the wonderful things her daughter might discover as she grew up. Maybe she would play music too. Maybe she would create beauty that touched other people's hearts. In the wings of the stage, Mrs. Chun stood with her hand pressed to her chest. Her heart was beating fast, not from nervousness but from pure joy. This was why she had become a music teacher. Not to train students to play notes correctly, but to help them find their voices. To witness moments like this when a young person discovered the magic they carried inside them. The principal, Mr. Rodriguez, was supposed to be watching the time and making sure the show stayed on schedule, but he had completely forgotten about his clipboard and his stopwatch. He was thinking about his own daughter, who was afraid to try new things because she worried about failing. He wanted to tell her about Sarah, about how courage and beauty could emerge from the most unlikely places. A group of Sarah's classmates sat together in the middle section. They had come to the talent show expecting to see the usual mix of amateur performances. Some good, some not so good, all forgettable. They had not expected to witness something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Emma, Sarah's friend who had questioned her choice to play a simple song, felt embarrassed about her earlier reaction. She realized now that she had completely misunderstood what music could be. She had thought it was about showing off technical skills or choosing impressive songs. Tonight she learned that real music was about connecting human hearts. In the sound booth at the back of the auditorium, the student who was running the lights and microphones had forgotten all about his technical responsibilities. He was supposed to be adjusting levels and preparing for the next act. Instead, he sat mesmerized, his hands frozen over the control board. The newspaper critic continued to scribble notes, but his handwriting was becoming increasingly illegible as he tried to capture something that seemed impossible to put into words. How do you describe the moment when a simple song becomes a masterpiece? How do you explain the feeling of witnessing pure artistic truth? Parents throughout the audience were having similar thoughts. Many of them had brought their phones to record their own children's performances, but Sarah's music had made them forget about documenting the moment. They were too busy living it. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly librarian who had taught at the school for 40 years before retiring, sat in the back row with tears in her eyes. She had seen thousands of students come and go, had watched hundreds of talent shows and school performances, but she had never seen anything like this. She thought about all the young people who never discovered their gifts because they were too afraid to try. The custodian, Mr. Williams, had stopped his work to listen from the doorway. He was not supposed to be in the auditorium during the performance, but something about the music had drawn him in. He stood holding his mop, completely transported by what he was hearing. Even the youngest children in the audience seemed to understand that something special was happening. 5-year-old Rosa, Sarah's cousin, sat perfectly still in her mother's lap. She did not understand the technical aspects of what she was hearing, but she could feel the beauty. It reminded her of being rocked to sleep, of fairy tales, of everything safe and wonderful in the world. The high school students who were waiting backstage to perform their own acts had stopped their nervous chattering. They stood in the wings, listening in amazement. Jennifer, who was scheduled to sing after the intermission, suddenly felt insecure about her own performance. How could she follow something like this? But then she realized that Sarah's performance was not about competition. It was about inspiration. Sarah had shown them all what was possible when someone had the courage to share their true self with the world. Instead of feeling intimidated, Jennifer felt motivated to dig deeper into her own art. The violin teacher from the community music school had come to support her former students who were performing tonight. She recognized immediately that she was hearing something extraordinary. Sarah's technique was not perfect by conservatory standards, but her musicality was beyond anything that could be taught. This was the kind of natural gift that appeared maybe once in a generation. An old man named Roberto, who had immigrated to America 50 years ago, was reminded of the folk musicians from his homeland. Sarah's playing had the same quality of speaking directly to the soul, bypassing the mind and going straight to the heart. He thought about his own children and grandchildren, and wondered if any of them had gifts they were afraid to share. The silence continued to stretch. It was as if everyone in the auditorium was afraid that moving or speaking would break the spell. They wanted to hold on to this feeling, this sense of having witnessed something pure and beautiful and real. Sarah stood on the stage, still not fully understanding what had happened. She knew she had played differently than she ever had before, but she could not grasp the full impact of what she had just shared. She only knew that something had changed, both in herself and in the room around her. The silence was becoming almost physical, like a presence in the room. It was heavy with emotion, thick with the unspoken understanding that everyone present had just shared something sacred. No one wanted to be the first to break it. Mrs. Chun realized that this silence was as much a part of the performance as the music itself. It was the audience's way of honoring what they had just heard. It was their collective recognition that they had been given a gift. Finally, after what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, the spell began to lift. But even as people started to stir, even as the first tentative movements began, everyone knew that they had been changed by what they had just experienced. The silence was ending, but its memory would last forever. As the sacred silence began to lift, something even more powerful took its place. The emotions that had been building in every heart during Sarah's performance finally found their release. It started with Frank, the elderly man in the front row. A single tear rolled down his weathered cheek. He was thinking about his late wife, Margaret, who had died 3 years ago. She had loved music, especially violin music. During their 57 years of marriage, they had attended countless concerts together. Margaret always said that the best performances were the ones that made you forget you were listening to music. Tonight, Frank understood exactly what she had meant. The tear that fell from Frank's eye seemed to give permission to others. Across the auditorium, people began to feel their own emotions rising to the surface. Sarah's mother, Maria, was no longer trying to hold back her tears. They flowed freely now as she remembered her own mother, Rosa, who had died when Sarah was 12. Rosa had always believed that music was a bridge between the living and the dead, between the heart and the soul. Tonight, Maria felt her mother's presence so strongly that she almost turned around to see if Rosa was sitting behind her. In the middle section, a woman named Catherine was crying for reasons she could not fully explain. She was a busy accountant who rarely had time for music or art. She had come tonight only because her neighbor's daughter was performing. But Sarah's playing had awakened something in Catherine that had been sleeping for years. She remembered being a child and wanting to take piano lessons, but her practical parents had said music was not a useful skill. Now, at 45, she felt a deep sadness for the dreams she had never pursued. 2 rows back, a young father named David held his 6-year-old son close. The music had made him think about all the moments he might miss while he was busy working long hours. He looked down at his son's face, lit up with wonder at the beautiful sounds, and made a silent promise to be more present, to notice the magic that existed in everyday life. Mrs. Chen stood in the wings with tears streaming down her face. She was thinking about all the students she had taught over the years, especially the ones who had given up on music because they thought they were not good enough. She wished they could all hear Sarah right now, could understand that music was not about being perfect. It was about being brave enough to share your heart. Near the back of the auditorium, the music critic had stopped taking notes altogether. His pen lay forgotten on his notepad as he wiped his eyes. He had attended thousands of performances in his career, from community theater to Carnegie Hall. He had heard world-famous violinists play concertos that cost millions of dollars to produce. But he had never been moved like this by a 17-year-old girl playing a children's song. The teenage performers waiting backstage were experiencing their own emotional awakening. Marcus, one half of the comedy duo, was not thinking about jokes anymore. He was thinking about his grandfather, who had taught him to find humor in difficult situations. His grandfather had been gone for 2 years, but something in Sarah's music brought back the memory of his gentle laughter. Jennifer, the pop singer, was reevaluating everything she thought she knew about performing. She had chosen her song because it was popular, because she thought it would impress people. But Sarah had shown her that the most powerful performances came from somewhere much deeper than the desire to impress. They came from the willingness to be vulnerable, to share something real. In the audience, children were having their own profound reactions. 8-year-old Emma Rodriguez had been fidgeting through most of the talent show, but Sarah's music had captured her complete attention. She sat perfectly still, her small hands clasped together, feeling something she had no words for. Later, she would tell her parents that the music made her feel like she was floating among the stars. An elderly woman named Dolores, who had moved to America from Italy 70 years ago, Was remembering her childhood in a small village where music was part of daily life. People sang while they worked, played instruments at celebrations, and gathered in the evenings to share songs. She had tried to recreate that sense of community in America, but life here was different, busier, more isolated. Tonight, for the first time in decades, she felt that sense of shared human connection that music could create. The local pastor, Reverend Johnson, was thinking about the sermons he gave every Sunday. He spent hours crafting words to help his congregation connect with something larger than themselves. But this 17-year-old girl had accomplished the same thing in 10 minutes with her violin. He made a mental note to talk to his music director about incorporating more instrumental music into their services. A group of teenagers, who usually spent their time texting and posting on social media, had put their phones away completely. They sat in silence, many of them crying as they experienced what it felt like to be fully present in a moment. Later, they would struggle to explain to their friends why a classical music performance had affected them so deeply. In the front section, a retired teacher named Mr. Morrison was thinking about his former student, a gifted young musician who had quit playing because his parents thought it was impractical. Mr. Morrison had always regretted not fighting harder to keep that student in music. He wondered where that boy was now, whether he ever thought about the music he had abandoned. The school nurse, Mrs. Garcia, was remembering her daughter, Elena, who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. Elena had played violin too, though. Not nearly as well as Sarah, but she had loved it with the same passion that Sarah displayed tonight. Mrs. Garcia felt her daughter's presence in the music, as if Elena was somehow speaking to her through Sarah's performance. A young couple on their first date sat holding hands, both of them crying. They had chosen the talent show as a casual, low-pressure way to spend an evening together. They had not expected to share such an intensely emotional experience. The music had stripped away all pretense, all the careful social barriers people usually maintained. They felt like they knew each other better after 10 minutes of Sarah's playing than they had after weeks of texting and conversation. The emotions in the room were creating their own energy. People could feel it in the air. A collective recognition that they were all connected, all human, all capable of being touched by beauty. The artificial boundaries that usually separated strangers in a public space had dissolved completely. Dr. Roberts, a psychologist who specialized in trauma therapy, was amazed by what he was witnessing. He had seen how music could heal, how it could reach patients when words failed, but he had never seen it work on such a large scale. The entire auditorium had become a healing space where people felt safe to experience their deepest emotions, even the most skeptical audience. Members found themselves moved. Mr. Thompson, a pragmatic businessman who usually had no patience for artsy events, discovered that his eyes were wet. He was thinking about his own children and whether he had been so focused on their academic success that he had forgotten to nurture their souls. The janitor, Mr. Williams, still stood in the doorway with his mop forgotten in his hand. He was thinking about his late wife, who had always wanted to learn to play an instrument but never had the chance. She had worked 2 jobs to support their family, sacrificing her own dreams for practical necessities. He wished she could hear this music, could know that somewhere, someone was making the kind of beauty she had always longed to create. Sarah herself was beginning to understand the power of what had just happened. Looking out at the audience, she could see the tears, the profound attention, the way people were leaning toward her as if they were trying to get closer to the source of the music. She realized that she had given these people something they needed, something they had been hungry for without even knowing it. Mrs. Chun, watching from the wings, understood that this was what every music teacher dreamed of, the moment when a student transcended technique and training to become a true artist. Sarah had not just played music. She had created a shared experience of beauty that would live in everyone's memory forever. The emotional crescendo was reaching its peak. An entire auditorium full of people had been transformed by one young woman's courage to share her gift. Hearts that had been closed were opening. Souls that had been weary were being refreshed. Spirits that had forgotten how to soar were remembering how to fly. And still, Sarah's last note seemed to linger in the air, continuing to work its magic on every person present. Sarah drew her bow across the strings one final time. The last note of her transformed, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star" hung in the air like a golden thread, connecting her heart to every person in the auditorium. The note seemed to float above the seated crowd, shimmering with all the emotion and beauty she had poured into it. As the sound began to fade, Sarah felt something she had never experienced before. It was as if time had stopped. The note seemed to go on forever, echoing not just in the physical space of the auditorium, but in some deeper dimension where music lived. She could feel it resonating in her chest, in her soul, in the very core of who she was. Slowly, carefully, Sarah lowered her violin from her shoulder. Her bow hand dropped to her side. For the first time since she had begun playing, she opened her eyes fully and looked out at the audience. What she saw took her breath away. Hundreds of faces looked back at her in complete silence. But this was not the silence of people who were not paying attention. This was not the silence of people who were bored or restless. This was the deepest, most profound silence Sarah had ever experienced. It was the silence of people who had been touched by something sacred. Every eye in the auditorium was focused on her. Every face showed the same expression of wonder and amazement. People sat perfectly still, as if they were afraid that the slightest movement might break a beautiful dream. Sarah began to feel worried. She had expected applause. At every other performance she had ever seen, the audience clapped when the music ended, but no one was clapping now. No one was moving at all. Had she done something wrong? Had she played too long? Had she changed the simple song too much? Maybe people were confused or disappointed. Maybe they had expected her to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star the normal way, and they were upset that she had made it into something else. Sarah's heart began to beat faster, but not with the excitement of performance. Now she felt anxiety creeping back in. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, still holding her violin and bow, waiting for some sign that would tell her what to do next. In the third row, her mother Maria sat with her hands pressed to her heart. Tears continued to stream down her face, but she was smiling through them. She wanted to jump up and cheer for her daughter, but something about the moment felt too sacred for loud celebration. It was as if Sarah had just finished praying and applause would be inappropriate. Next to Maria, Diego stared at his sister with a mixture of pride and amazement. He had always known Sarah was good at violin, but he had never understood that she was capable of creating something like this. He wanted to tell everyone around him, "That's my sister! That's my sister!" But like everyone else, he felt frozen by the beauty of what had just happened. Mrs. Chun stood in the wings, her heart pounding with joy and excitement. She recognized what was happening. This silence was not a sign of failure. It was the highest compliment an audience could give a performer. It meant that Sarah had created something so beautiful, so moving, that people needed time to absorb it before they could respond. But Sarah could not see Mrs. Chun from where she stood. All she could see was an auditorium full of silent people, staring at her. The seconds ticked by, and still no one made a sound. Sarah began to wonder if she should say something or bow or just walk off the stage. In the front row, Frank, the elderly man, was reliving 50 years of memories that Sarah's music had awakened. He was seeing his wedding day, the birth of his children, quiet evenings with his wife, family gatherings where his grandmother had played piano. The music had opened doors in his heart that he thought had been closed forever. He needed this silence to process everything he was feeling. Behind him, Dr. Roberts, the psychologist, was marveling at what he was witnessing. He had studied the effects of music on human emotion for years, but he had never seen anything like this. An entire audience had been transported to a different emotional state. They were all sharing the same experience of transcendence, and they needed this quiet time to understand what had happened to them. The newspaper critic sat with his pen still in his hand, but he had not written anything for several minutes. How could words capture what he had just heard? How could he describe the way a simple children's song had become a masterpiece? How could he explain the feeling of witnessing a moment of pure artistic truth? Sarah's classmates sat in amazement. They saw her every day in the hallways, in the cafeteria, in classes. She was just Sarah, quiet, shy. Ordinary Sarah, but tonight they had discovered that ordinary people could create extraordinary beauty. Several of them were thinking about their own hidden talents, wondering what gifts they might be carrying inside themselves without knowing it. The young mother in the back row held her baby close. Both of them completely still, the baby seemed to sense that something important was happening. Her wide eyes stayed focused on the stage, as if she understood that she was witnessing something she would want to remember, even though she was too young to put it into words. A group of elementary school children sat with their parents, all of them unusually quiet for children their age. They did not fully understand what they had heard, but they knew it was special. 8-year-old Marcus would later tell his teacher that the music made him feel like he was flying. 6-year-old Lisa would draw pictures of stars for weeks afterward, trying to capture the feeling Sarah's violin had given her. The silence stretched on 30 seconds, 45 seconds. A full minute. Still no one moved. Still no one spoke. Still no one applauded. Sarah began to feel tears forming in her own eyes, not tears of joy, but tears of confusion and worry. She had tried so hard to do something beautiful, and now she was afraid she had failed. The silence felt heavy and judgmental. She started to think about how she could apologize, how she could explain that she had not meant to change the song so much, but then something happened that changed everything. In the middle section of the auditorium, a woman named Grace slowly rose to her feet. She did not plan to stand up. Her body simply lifted itself as if drawn by an invisible force. She stood there in silence, looking at Sarah with eyes full of gratitude and wonder. Seeing Grace stand up, the man next to her felt compelled to do the same. Then the person next to him stood. And then another person and another, like a gentle wave moving across a pond. People throughout the auditorium began to rise. They stood not to leave, but to honor what they had just experienced. They stood to show Sarah that what she had given them was precious beyond words. Within moments, the entire auditorium was on its feet. Hundreds of people standing in complete silence, looking at a 17-year-old girl who had just shown them what magic looked like. Sarah saw them all standing and felt her heart skip a beat. But this time it was not from fear. It was from a sudden understanding that she had not failed at all. She had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. These people were not standing because they were disappointed. They were standing because they were grateful. The silence continued, but now it felt different to Sarah. It no longer felt empty or judgmental. It felt full of love, full of appreciation, full of shared recognition that something beautiful had just been born in that room. Mrs. Chun stepped slightly forward from the wings, tears streaming down her face. She had never seen anything like this in 25 years of teaching. A standing ovation before any applause, it was unheard of. It was the kind of response that professional musicians dreamed of receiving. The silence was no longer just absence of sound. It had become a presence in itself. It was the sound of hearts being opened, of souls being touched, of a community being created through shared experience of beauty. Sarah stood in the center of it all, finally understanding that she had not done something wrong. She had done something miraculous. She had taken a simple song and transformed it into a gift that touched every person in the room. The silence was not criticism. It was reverence. And in that moment of understanding, Sarah felt her grandmother's presence stronger than ever before. She knew that Grandma Rosa was proud, that the music had carried her spirit into the room and connected Sarah with everyone who heard it. The profound silence continued, holding everyone in its embrace, creating a memory that would last forever. The silence finally broke like a dam bursting. It started with one person clapping, Frank, the elderly man in the front row, who could no longer contain his emotions. His weathered hands came together in slow, deliberate applause that echoed through the quiet auditorium like thunder. Then, as if his clapping had given everyone else permission to release their pent-up feelings, The entire auditorium exploded into the most thunderous applause Sarah had ever heard. But this was not ordinary clapping. This was applause filled with genuine emotion, with gratitude, with amazement, with love. People were not just clapping with their hands. They were clapping with their whole hearts. The sound was overwhelming, rolling through the auditorium in waves that seemed to lift Sarah off her feet. She had never imagined that applause could feel so warm, so embracing, so full of human connection. But the applause was only the beginning. One by one, people began to stand. Not the polite, obligatory standing that sometimes happened at school performances, but the kind of standing ovation that came from deep inside, that could not be contained or controlled. First it was the front section, then the middle, then the back. Within seconds, every single person in the auditorium was on their feet, clapping and cheering and wiping tears from their eyes. Sarah stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response. She had expected polite applause and then a quick exit back to the safety of the wings. Instead, she was receiving the kind of ovation that she had only seen in movies about famous performers. Her mother, Maria, was clapping so hard her hands hurt, but she could not stop. Next to her, Diego was whooping and cheering, all his teenage coolness forgotten in his excitement for his sister. Behind them, Sarah's aunt and uncle were crying and applauding at the same time. Little Rosa, Sarah's 5-year-old cousin, was jumping up and down in her seat, clapping her small hands together and shouting, "That was beautiful! That was so beautiful!" Mrs. Chen emerged from the wings, her face radiant with joy and pride. She walked over to Sarah and gave her a fierce hug right there on the stage, in front of everyone. "I knew you had magic in you," she whispered in Sarah's ear. "I just never knew how much." The applause continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 3 or 4 minutes. People did not want it to end. They wanted to keep showing Sarah how much her performance had meant to them. As the clapping finally began to fade, people started calling out, "Bravo!" shouted the music critic from the back of the auditorium. "Beautiful!" called a woman from the middle section. "More! More!" chanted a group of students, but Sarah was too overwhelmed to play anything else. She stood holding her violin and Bao, smiling through her tears, trying to take in the magnitude of what had just happened. Principal Rodriguez walked onto the stage with a huge smile on his face. He had been running talent shows for 15 years, and he had never seen anything like this. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, "I think we can all agree that Sarah Martinez has just given us something truly special tonight." This brought another round of applause and cheering. "Sarah," Mr. Rodriguez said, turning to her, "that was extraordinary. Thank you for sharing your gift with all of us." Sarah managed to say, "Thank you," into the microphone, her voice shaking with emotion. Then she walked off the stage on legs that felt like jelly, still not quite believing what had just happened. But the impact of her performance was only beginning. As people filed out of the auditorium after the show ended, they could not stop talking about what they had heard. The conversations continued in the parking lot, in cars on the way home, at kitchen tables over late-night snacks. "Did you hear that girl play violin? I've never heard anything like it. She took a children's song and made it into something magical. I couldn't stop crying. She's going to be famous someday." The next morning, Sarah woke up to find that her life had changed overnight. The first sign was her phone. She had dozens of text messages from classmates, friends, relatives, and even people she barely knew. Everyone wanted to tell her how amazing her performance had been. "Sarah, I had no idea you were so talented," texted her friend Emma. "You made me cry happy tears," wrote her cousin Michael. "Can you teach my daughter to play like that?" asked a neighbor, but the messages were just the beginning. That afternoon, the local newspaper published a review of the talent show. The music critic, James Morrison, had written an entire article focused on Sarah's performance. The headline read, "High School Student Creates Magic with Simple Song." In the article, Morrison wrote, "In 30 years of covering musical performances, I have rarely been as moved as I was last night by 17-year-old Sarah Martinez. Her interpretation of Twinkle, Little Star was nothing short of masterful. She took a melody that everyone knows and transformed it into something profound and beautiful. This young woman has a rare gift, and our community is fortunate to have witnessed its emergence. Sarah's mother read the article aloud at breakfast, her voice full of pride and amazement. Diego kept interrupting to say, "They're talking about my sister, my sister." But the newspaper article was nothing compared to what happened next. Mrs. Patterson, the retired school librarian, had recorded Sarah's performance on her phone. Without asking anyone's permission, she posted the video online. With the caption, "This beautiful young woman just brought an entire auditorium to tears with her violin." The video began to spread. First, it was shared by people who had been at the talent show. Then their friends shared it. Then their friends' friends. Within a week, the video had been viewed thousands of times. Within 2 weeks, it had been seen by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Comments poured in from everywhere. "This gave me chills. I can't stop watching this. How is she not famous already?" Music like this reminds me why I love being human. My grandmother would have loved this. Along with the online attention came real-world opportunities that Sarah had never dreamed of. The director of the State Youth Orchestra called Mrs. Chun, asking if Sarah would be interested in auditioning for first chair violin. A talent scout from a prestigious music conservatory reached out, offering Sarah a full scholarship to their summer program. The local symphony orchestra invited her to perform as a guest soloist at their next concert. A recording studio in the state capital offered to help her make a professional album. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other young musicians. Teenagers from around the country began reaching out to Sarah, telling her that her video had inspired them to pursue their own musical dreams. "I quit piano last year because I thought I wasn't good enough," wrote a 15-year-old girl from Oregon. "But seeing you made me realize that music isn't about being perfect. It's about sharing something beautiful. I started playing again yesterday. I've been too scared to perform in public," wrote a 16-year-old boy from Texas. "But you showed me that being nervous is okay if you're doing something that matters. I just signed up for my school's talent show." These messages meant more to Sarah than all the praise from adults and professionals. She realized that her moment of courage had given other young people permission to be brave. Mrs. Chun was not surprised by any of this. She had recognized Sarah's extraordinary gift from the first day she heard her playing alone in the music room. What surprised her was how quickly the world had discovered what she had known all along. "You've learned something important," Mrs. Chun told Sarah during one of their regular practice sessions. "You've learned that your gift is not just for you. It's meant to be shared. And when you share it with courage and authenticity, it touches people in ways you never expected." Sarah's family life changed too. Her mother framed the newspaper article and hung it in the living room. Diego started telling everyone at school that his sister was basically famous. Her extended family began calling regularly, wanting to hear about her latest opportunities and achievements. But the most profound change was in Sarah herself. The shy, anxious girl who had been afraid to play in front of people was slowly transforming into a confident young woman who understood the power of her gift. She still felt nervous before performances, but now she knew that nerves were not something to be feared. They were a sign that she cared deeply about what she was doing. More importantly, Sarah had learned that hiding her talents did not protect her from failure. It only guaranteed that she would never experience the joy of success. She had discovered that the scariest thing she could do was also the most rewarding. 6 months later, Sarah performed as a guest soloist with the local symphony orchestra. The auditorium was packed with people who had heard about the girl who could make magic with a violin. She played a beautiful piece by Mozart, not Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, but a sophisticated violin concerto that challenged every aspect of her technique. But at the end of her performance, something special happened. The conductor whispered something to Sarah, and she smiled and nodded. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conductor announced to the audience, "Sarah would like to share something with you." The piece that started it all? Sarah raised her violin once more and began to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. But this was not the same version she had played at the talent show. This was even more beautiful, more refined, more emotionally rich.